Test, test. Okay. We're all set. Hello, friends. Good. Just a few of us today. That's all right. Well, if I'm there, I'm not going to be in my little shot. So today, what I'd like to do, we have handouts here for Luke 23. And so we're entering Holy Week, as you know. Today is Palm Sunday. And I think I've shared that Luke is my favorite gospel, though he is the wordiest. What you have in front of you here is a single chapter of Luke. And there's a lot of words. And that's kind of Luke's style, is that he's very, very wordy. And maybe there's a reason why I like him the best and have a career where I get to be very wordy for a living. But Palm Sunday, for me growing up, was one that we always kind of did what we're actually going to do today, which is the palms, and there's this celebration. There's this kind of the weirdness of the celebration because we know where the week is headed. But the vibe of Palm Sunday was always kind of rejoicing and really focused on the story of Jesus coming into Jerusalem. Well, it's been a while now, but a lot of our churches are only catching up with it, that it's no longer just called Palm Sunday, it's Palm/Passion Sunday. And so what we're supposed to do is actually read this in worship as well. And the reason for that is multifold, but one is that most of the people in all of our churches, of any background and denomination, they come on Sunday and they don't come to the week services. And so if you imagine that, you're here today, and then, hey, we got the palms, and yay, Jesus, and yeah, a week will turn out a little rough for you, but we'll see you next Sunday, and then he's risen from the dead. And we never actually get to the crucifixion, right? We never actually get to enter into the story, which is strange for me, because I grew up as a pastor's kid going to everything. So the rhythm of Palm Sunday seemed right to me. But the truth is, most of us, don't go to all of the midweek services, and so we miss it. We miss the crucifixion, which is, pretty big deal in our faith. And so what I've been doing at most churches I've been serving at for several years now is really focusing on the passion element. Well, we're not doing that today. We are going to be doing kind of old school palms and celebration today. But we have the opportunity to look at Luke 23. The other reason I want to look at it is because when you come to Good Friday service and you're trying to be a lectionary follower the way I am, they always give you John's account. And I love John's account of the crucifixion. It's fantastic. But it's one of four. And to hear it every single year on Good Friday, when do we ever get to hear Matthew, Mark, or Luke? And so if you come to Good Friday this week, you will hear John. But I wanted to give us some time in Luke. So I know there's only a few of us, but I thought we could read this whole chapter together, out loud, and we'll just take turns and take as long as it takes. Before we jump into it, though, I just want to invite you, as best you can, and it's always made me mad when people used to do this to me and they were on this end of the podium, as best as you can, knowing that you will fail at it. Try to not bring all of your assumptions of what you think the death of Jesus is about to this text. And try to let it be its own voice. We are taught, most of us, a pretty clear narrative about why Jesus had to die. I have come to question that narrative. And as I think that's appropriate in all of our matters of faith, that we're given a kind of kid's version of things, as needs to happen for kids, right? They can't be given everything that adults are given. But sometimes I worry in our churches, it's like we give the kids' version and then we just stay with it the rest of our lives. We never question what we're taught. We're never given the opportunity to go, what else might be going on here in this text? So I'm going to invite you to as best you can, not take all of your assumptions about why this happened, what's going on here, and just allow Luke's voice to be Luke's voice. And the last thing I want to say before we jump in is, as I continue to grow and live with these texts year in, year out, they humble me now, these texts do. I don't have a mastery over them. And they're all different too, right? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all have a different take on what happened. Jesus doesn't act the same in all of them, doesn't say the same things in all of them. And sometimes our liturgies really confuse that, right? Where I know Covenant's had history of this, and my churches have growing up too, where you'll get to Good Friday service and you'll hear the 7 words of Jesus from the cross. But to hear them, you've got to jump between Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, because it doesn't say the same thing in all 4 Gospels, which isn't a terrible thing. But when we create our worship service that way, we fail to hear the unique voice of each one of these gospel writers. So that is my intro. Somebody want to get us started on Luke 23. And when you get tired, you can just stop, and then someone else can pick up where you left off.
I'll start.
Thank you.
The whole assembly got up and led Jesus to Pilate and began to accuse him. They said, "We have found this man misleading our people, opposing the payment of taxes to Caesar, claiming that he is the Christ, the King." Pilate asked, "Are you the King of the Jews?" Jesus replied, "That's what you say." Then Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, "I find no legal basis for action against this man." They objected strenuously, saying, "He agitates the people with his teaching throughout Judea, starting from Galilee all the way here." Here it is. Pilate asked if the man was Galilee. When he learned that Jesus was from Herod's district, Pilate sent him to Herod, who was also in Jerusalem at that time. Herod was very glad to see Jesus, for he had heard about Jesus and wanted to see him for quite some time. He was hoping to see Jesus perform some sign. Herod questioned Jesus at length, but Jesus didn't respond to it. The chief priests and legal experts were there, fiercely accusing Jesus. Herod and his soldiers treated Jesus with contempt. Herod mocked him by dressing Jesus in elegant clothes and sent him back to Pilate. Pilate and Herod became friends with each other that day. Before this, they had been enemies. Then Pilate called together the chief priests and rulers. He said to them, "You brought this man before me as one who was misleading me. I have questioned him in your presence and found nothing in this man's conduct that provides a legal basis for the charges you have brought against him. Neither did Herod, because Herod returned to us. He's done nothing that deserves death. Therefore, I'll have him whipped, then let him go."
So I'm going to pick up there at verse 18. Thank you, Reese.
But with one voice they shouted, "Away with this man! Release Barabbas to us!" Barabbas had been thrown into prison because of a riot that had occurred in the city and for murder. Pilate addressed them again because he wanted to release Jesus. They kept shouting out, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" For the 3rd time, Pilate said to them, "Why? What wrong has he done? I found no legal basis for the death penalty in his case. Therefore, I will have him whipped, then let him go." But they were adamant, shouting their demand that Jesus be crucified. Their voices went out. Pilate issued his decision to grant their request. He released the one they asked for, who had been thrown into prison because of a riot and murder. But he handed Jesus over to their will.
As they led Jesus away, they grabbed Simon, a man from Cyrene, who's coming in from the countryside. They put the cross on his back and made him carry it behind Jesus. A huge crowd of people followed Jesus, including women who were mourning and wailing for him. Jesus turned to the women and said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, don't cry for me. Rather, cry for yourselves and your children. The time will come when they will say, 'Happy are those who are unable to become pregnant, the wombs that never gave birth, and the breasts that never nursed a child.' Then they will say to the mountains, 'Fall on us,' and to the hills, 'Cover us.' If they do these things when the tree is green, what will happen when it is dry?" They also led 2 other criminals to be executed with Jesus. When they arrived at the place called the Skull, they crucified him along with the criminals, one on his right and the other on his left. Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing." They drew lots as a way of dividing up his clothing.
The people were standing around watching, but the leaders sneered at him, saying, he saved others, let him save himself if he really is the Christ sent from God, the chosen one. The soldiers also mocked him. They came up to him, offering him sour wine, and saying, "If you really are the King of the Jews, save yourself." Above his head was a notice of the formal charge against him. It read, "This is the King of the Jews." One of the criminals hanging next to Jesus insulted him, "Aren't you the Christ? Save yourself and us." Responding, the other criminal spoke harshly to him. "Don't you fear God, seeing that you've also been sentenced to die? We are rightly condemned, for we are receiving the appropriate sentence, but for what we did. But this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus replied, "I assure you that today you will be with me in paradise."
It was now about noon, and darkness covered the whole earth until about 3 o'clock, while the sun stopped shining, and the curtain in the sanctuary tore down the middle. Crying out in a loud voice, Jesus said, "Father, into your hands I entrust my life." After he said this, he breathed for the last time. When the centurion saw what happened, he praised God, saying, "It's really true, this man was righteous." All the crowds who had come together to see this event returned to their homes beating their chests after seeing what had happened. And everyone who knew him, including the women who had followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance, observing these things.
Someone will take us home.
Now there was a man named Joseph who was a member of the council. He was a good and righteous man. He hadn't agreed with the plan and actions of the council. He was from the Jewish city of Arimathea and eagerly anticipated God's kingdom. This man went to Pilate and asked for Jesus' body. Taking it down, he wrapped it in a linen cloth and laid it in a tomb carved out of rock, in which no one had ever been buried. It was the preparation day for the Sabbath, and the Sabbath was quickly approaching. The women who had come with Jesus from Galilee followed Joseph. They saw the tomb in which Jesus' body was laid in it. Then they went away and prepared fragrant spices and perfumed oils. They rested on the Sabbath, keeping the commandment.
Thank you. I contemplated, actually, I planned on doing all of Luke 22 as well because there's so much great stuff in there. But then I realized that was going to be like 6 pages of single-spaced word text, and I thought this is enough. So hearing this, story again, but hearing it on its own, what stands out to you this time around as you read, as you heard it? Was there something that you noticed, something that strikes you, something that you wondered about here in Luke's version of Jesus' crucifixion?
Well, it seems really reluctant for a lot of it.
Yeah, Pilate is a reluctant actor, isn't he? Which is interesting. Yes, it's very interesting. And why? Because Pilate is someone who has a ton of power in the situation, really the most power. So why does Luke frame him as reluctant? And I don't know that I have an answer to that, but it's very interesting.
Well, and especially for anyone that just recites the Apostles' Creed.
Yes.
Crucified under Pilate, so you automatically assume Pilate's the bad guy.
Yeah.
Until you really read the scripture and figure out that, oh, wait a minute.
Yeah, it's amazing that Pilate makes it into the creed. It's very, I don't think you would expect that.
But a question about that, though, is, it was Pilate, and they because I wonder if it's any other reason that Pilate was just the governor at the time, because during the time, there's 1 or 2 references, he was born in the time of Caesar Augustus, and it's not a lengthy history of Augustus Caesar.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot there, but it's just, oh yeah, this was, here's a frame of reference. It was during the time of Caesar Augustus. And you remember this when Pilate was governor, so that's who they turned him over to.
Mm-hmm.
Things like that.
And, there's a reluctance here, which is very, very interesting on a lot of levels. But in the end, who is responsible for Jesus being put to death. In the most literal
It's
sense.
final.
It is
It's
Pilate. It is Pilate. In the most literal sense,
You and me.
Pilate's the one who gives the go. Now, he's reluctant, he doesn't want you, he's under pressure, he tries to hand it off to Herod, there's no thank you. But there is a literal sense in which Pilate is responsible. And I think that matters for a lot of reasons, not least because over the last 2,000 years, there's been all kinds of anti-Semitism that wants to place the blame for Jesus' death on the Jews. It's like, well, the Creed actually got it right. It was the Roman Empire that put Jesus to death. Under pressure? Sure. What politician moves unless they're under pressure, right? Politicians only act when they're under pressure. So there is a literal sense in which Pilate, I think, is right, but it's also not the whole story, right? As we see.
So, I mean, I had a question about, unbelieving Jews, because, I've heard that in other services, but what exactly does under the Jews mean? Because the reason I ask that is because I don't take that to mean anyone who today will be a follower of what today is Judaism.
Sure.
But a very specific political,
Yes.
religious
Elite, really.
section, the Pharisees, hey, this guy is messing with our thing. So,
And in particular, in this case, it says the chief priests, who probably would not have been Pharisees. There is, as we see in the Gospels, there's a definite conflict between Jesus and the Pharisees. But when we get to Jerusalem, Jerusalem's the center of power, and Pharisees really aren't the people in control. It's the Sadducees. The high priest, Caiaphas, is a Sadducee. And everybody who is in the deepest collusion with the Romans, which is the only way to survive, right? They've determined, we need to keep this nation alive and not be squashed. We don't want to go into exile the way that we were in Babylon again. And the only way they knew how to do that was by brokering some peace with the Romans, and the people who were willing to do that were the Sadducees. The Pharisees were too pure for that, right? They saw through the corruption of the Sadducees and were much more priests of the people. They were much more, they didn't have the money. The Sadducees had the money. They were priests of the people. So there is a conflict there for sure, but once we get in Jerusalem, it's really the Sadducees now who are calling the shots.
but when the Bible says the Jews had, it doesn't really mean that narrow.
Yeah, that's the question. And now we're stepping up. In this gospel, it doesn't seem that way, does it? And it all comes through John, which is also kind of tragic that we always read John every Good Friday, because John, whatever he means, and I think we can have a really good discussion about what he means, but what it says is the Jews, over and over again throughout the gospel. The Jews tried to put Jesus to death. So the more modern translations will often say the Jewish leaders. Although it's not in the Greek. If you go to the Greek, it's just Juden, right? And it's just Jews. But is that actually what John meant? Well, it's hard to imagine he meant that literally, because John was Jewish, right? So, but it's the problematic gospel. So the reason we have to do that, to go out of our way here, is because there is a history through the last 2,000 years that on Good Friday was the most dangerous day of the year to be Jewish in Europe. Because people would go to church and they would hear this, and instead of feeling implicated themselves, they go, "You put our Savior to death, which also somehow saved me, so why am I mad?" None of it makes any sense. There's no logic to it, but Jews have been so deeply otherized in particularly Christian Europe, but that also came over here as well. That it's incumbent on us who have that history as part of our family history to go out of our way to not have any anti-Semitic readings.
But don't you think the human penchant is this great desire to assign blame?
Yes,
And
you bet it is.
And conveniently, there were the Jews. Okay. You asked about the reading. What struck me is that on a piece of paper here in black and white, and not looking in a Bible, it actually reads for me kind of like a newspaper article. All right. And it's a lot more unemotional than I'm used to living this chapter. And I find myself wondering, well, I wonder if it's just really kind of another report of an event of the day, and then in a few days, the vast majority of the people just kind of moved on.
Sure. I mean, people being crucified in Jerusalem wouldn't have been some rare occasion, especially the time of year. This is at Passover. So again, put yourself in the shoes of the people of power, both Roman or Sadducees. You have thousands of people coming into Jerusalem to celebrate their liberation from an oppressive foreign government. That's what the Passover is. Remember how God delivered us from our oppressors. And so there were, over the years, all kinds of precedent for violent uprisings against the Romans in Jerusalem during Passover. And if you are the one trying to keep your people alive, at best, or at worst, trying to keep your money flowing, and probably, like every politician, both. I don't think they were just pure evil, the Sadducees. I think they're oftentimes probably trying their best in a really tough time. And so you put yourself in their shoes and you see this guy come in, and we didn't read, the previous chapter. What does he do? He leads this demonstration in the temple, overthrowing tables, disrupting the economic, religious, and social and political center of Israel during the most dangerous time of the year for violent uprisings. What do you think was going to happen? And of course he's doing this on purpose, right? Of course he's doing this on purpose. Fine.
I came in late and I was listening instead of watching it. And it struck me that people are so much against change.
Thank you. Talk more about that. People are against change.
Yeah, even when it's going to be good for them, they do not understand it. And oh my gosh, isn't that where we are today?
Change is always, there is a loss
Yeah.
that comes, I think, with every form of change, no matter what it is. Even if the change is good, there's still a loss because it's not what once was. And usually whatever once was, there was some element of it that was good. There was some element that was meaningful to us. And so, yeah, change is very, very scary for us.
On both sides.
Well, especially the emphasis that the Jewish faith has on the tradition and following and keeping the story alive.
Yeah, the tradition kept them alive.
Yeah, we are just reading people and honoring and following all of the rituals and all of the.
Well, it's not bash the Jews.
No, I'm not. I'm saying that's
It's what kept them alive.
that's what kept them alive, was having this unity.
That's right. Which was a good thing.
And through what has happened to them.
How many peoples were conquered by either the Assyrians or the Babylonians, conquered, sent into exile, who we never hear from again? And the answer is almost all of them, except for the Jews. And so, yes, they are kept alive. So these rituals, religiously, as well as then just the realpolitik of keeping the peace, I don't blame them for any of this. There's some really unique stuff here. Anything else stand out to you as you read this? There's the literal sense of Pilate, but there's other stuff going on too. Yeah.
Well, what really struck me this time was, first, Jesus is very, very short and succinct in every one of his answers. And he says very little.
There's almost, do you sense like maybe some sass almost, like in verse 3?
Yeah, oh yeah.
That's what you say. It's like,
Yeah,
wait, did I?
Okay, yeah, I know. So, but he's very, very good at succinct in saying exactly what he wants to say in 2 or 3 words. And then he goes into this huge diatribe to the women of
Yes.
the daughters of Jerusalem.
Very strange.
Don't
And
cry
I think
for
this only happens in Luke. So what do we think is going on there?
I don't know. He's lamenting that, oh man, here I've just spent 3 years in this ministry, and it's all going to fall apart.
Let's call it another real good teaching moment. Leave it at that.
What's he teaching for? What is he warning them about?
He's mourning that when I'm gone, what's going to be left? I left it in the hands of these 12 apostles that I've been teaching, and they're hiding.
In today's reading, when we go to, I include two verses that the lectionary didn't recommend, which is he goes in Jerusalem, cold, yay. And today, incidentally, if you listen very carefully, there's actually no palms. Nor is there the word Hosanna. That Luke Jesus comes in, but the things that we normally associate aren't in Luke's version, they're in the other ones. Just always interesting to point out the uniqueness of it. But he, the Pharisees there, and it's in this reading for this morning, it's not clear if the Pharisees are actually part of Jesus' disciples, because some of them were. And so they say, tell your disciples to be quiet. And I think that you're going to get us all killed. They know what's going on. They know the realpolitik of Jerusalem. So it's not clear, are these Pharisees who are, among his followers, or are they just observers saying, stop this? We don't know. When he says, if they stay silent, even the stones will cry out. But then he looks at Jerusalem and begins to weep. Because he says you've rejected the way of peace. I think, again, all of these Gospels have many layers of meaning. But on the literal sense, which is, I think, some of the lowest sense, some of us, we talk the literal sense is the only sense. I don't know. That's step one. And then the text invites us to interpret it over and over and over again. Keep turning the diamond. But the literal warning, I think, is about the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD. That when in these people, in the reader's lifetime, would people have said, hills come and fall on us, when it would have been better to not have been born, the sacking of Jerusalem in 70 AD was absolutely horrific. And so,
wouldn't a lot of these, it seems like a longer time, Marco, because a lot of these people who were talking to would probably be dead by the time that happened. So
Yeah.
the question I was asking,
or is it written afterwards, which is
that's
what a
what I
lot
was
of
going to ask, if this gospel was written after Adrian made that call and
Yeah.
said, okay.
we don't know. And so a lot of scholars for the last couple of years have said, yes, it's afterwards. There are some indications that it could be earlier, and I don't have a vested interest. But one thing that's interesting is that when he does predict the temple's destruction in chapter 20 or 21, somewhere in there, he says no stone will be left upon another. Well, if you were Luke and you knew that that's not what happened, the Wailing Wall was still there, right? So not every stone was knocked over. That's a tiny little sliver that maybe this was leading up to. And it's not like you needed to be God incarnate to see where this story was going. Right? You could be an astute observer of Israel and the politics with them and Rome and see this is going somewhere bad if we don't find a way of peace. So it could be that it's beforehand, before 70 AD, in the late 60s maybe, or it could be afterwards, we don't know. It's certainly around, Luke, it's not going to be any later than 75. So it's either right after or probably just before. The women is very interesting. That word women shows up several times in this chapter. The women are following him, and he cries out for them, and then they're mentioned later on as well. Verse 49, everyone who knew him, including the women who had followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance observing these things.
And then they segue from the women to the criminals, Gail.
Yeah, they do.
Let's talk about the criminals. This is only Luke's gospel. We get here, you only get Luke, which is another reason I want to bring this up.
And is this the only gospel that talks about
In this way.
The fact is, it doesn't need to be there. So the fact that it is there says something in and of itself, right?
Yep. Jeannie, were you going to share an
I'm just
observation?
curious about the release of Barabbas.
Yes, Barabbas.
I mean, was this
A custom.
something that happened during that?
According to the gospel writers, yes. We have no, as far as I know, evidence of that outside the gospels. So the gospel writers have us believe there's this tradition of releasing a prisoner on the Passover. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't, but we don't, Jewish scholars would say, we haven't heard anything about this. So we don't know. Now, sometimes those things happen, and then years later, you dig something up and realize, oh, this was a tradition. So I don't have an opinion on it, but Luke is certainly using it to teach us something, regardless of what happened historically. This is here to teach us something, which is, according to Luke, there's this tradition of releasing a criminal, and his name is Barabbas. That name, Bar, is son in Hebrew. And anybody recognize the word Abba? So the word literally means son of the Father. Amazing, right?
No.
So, when we think symbolically, there's all kinds of symbolism pouring off the page here. Is that here is someone who is named son of the Father, who is, according to Luke, guilty, a murderer, and has actually led the type of insurrection that these people are accusing Jesus of doing, which he hasn't done. And he's going to get released, and Jesus is not. So there's something about innocence and guilt and exchange, someone going free, someone being condemned, that's very present here in Luke's gospel. What it all means, I can't tell you, but it's there.
Well, not to be tangential, but, there was just, I think today, last night, the release of 2 Ukrainian held prisoners in Russia, and then vice versa.
Mm.
No release of prisoners, so it's, I don't know.
Yeah.
It has nothing
Innocent
to do with
people
it, but
are-
then again, it's,
In our world and in their world, innocent people are condemned to death by the state. Guilty people are set free by the state. And then also in our collective consciousness, right? It's not just the state, it's also all of our outrage, right? Like you said earlier, we always want someone to blame. Yes, we do. And this gospel is very much about that instinct of what do we do with our human need for someone to be blamed. I think that is absolutely central to whatever Luke is trying to teach us about the cross.
Well, I think this gospel, this chapter, also seems to point out the power of demagoguery, because they, the people, like some of the Sadducees, the Pharisees, someone, think about this. Somewhat parable before, but he comes into Jerusalem in triumph, great. A few days later,
All hell breaks loose.
people someone has convinced these people that Jesus should be treated as though he's the devil incarnate,
That's right.
instead of a heretical theologian.
Right.
And so it's like the adding insult, hey, this guy committed murder. He's still better than that Jesus guy. Let Barabbas go instead.
Right.
And it's like that people are almost something akin to a riot. That people are carried along in this wave of self-righteousness that's ginned up.
Yeah.
And whoever was driving this, parallels today,
Yep.
skipped people's logical functions and went to the amygdala level.
That's right. Very well said. That we skip over our reason, our logic, and we go straight to fight or flight. Someone else is responsible for all of your problems, and let's all gang up on them and say they're the bad people, right? No applications to our world today. And how about this? Not just the people who are doing it, but like people with vested political interests, which is very much in play here. And that, they're trying to, like I said, and their political interests aren't all evil, and I don't think they are today either, but it's not in the interests of truth. Whatever it was, whatever they're doing with Jesus has nothing to do with what's actually true. Even if they're trying to save Jerusalem, they're not interested in bringing forth justice when it comes to
this idea of sacrifice is just, and it was even in other cultures, like you look at the Mayan culture and some of the, sacrificing humans, sacrificing animals, temple. How
Yep.
about Abraham and Isaac?
That's right.
So
It's all over
it's
the Old
so-
Testament.
Yeah, and so.
I'm so glad, let's stay there for a moment.
Bit of a-
That's such a great point, Jeannie, and I really want to make sure that we take a moment on this. Forget what you know about Old Testament sacrifices for this moment, but just on Luke 23. Who demands that Jesus die? The people do, and who else? Pilate ultimately does. He concedes to it. So their demand might be a little too strong, but at least he permits it. So there's Pilate represents, right, the politics of the day. So the politicians in power and the high priest. And so you have a convergence of political power, religious power, and then the mob of the people. And I don't see anything in here that says, and God the Father put Jesus to death and demanded it. Now that comes to us because of really Christian theology, but then we root it in the Old Testament scriptures. Go, well, God demanded animals in the Old Testament, he's going to demand Jesus now. Fine, you can't find that here. That comes in from other parts of our theology, but when we go to the Gospels themselves, it seems pretty clear, and I think this is true in all 4 Gospels, that the people responsible, the ones who are responsible for Jesus dying, it's not God, it's humanity. We're the ones who demand he die. And you mentioned earlier that the crowd's going from cheering to crucifying. I'm going to mention that in my sermon. And again, I'm always trying to, on the literal level, if we want to go historically, I can't imagine the same people who are waving the branches are the same ones saying crucifying him. That doesn't make any sense historically. Because there are thousands of people in Jerusalem for all kinds of people. And the march into Jerusalem is probably at best a couple dozen people. It's not hundreds of people, thousands of people. It's probably a small demonstration of Jesus' disciples, primarily. Whereas the crowds here, in the middle of the night, ginned up by the chief priests, would not have been the ones waving the branches. So in the literal historical sense, different crowds. And I think it's important to recognize. But for Luke, here's one that jumped out to me. Verse 18. With one voice they shouted, "Away with this man, release Barabbas to us." There's a unanimity of voices. Same thing in verse 23. They were adamant, shouting their demand that Jesus be crucified. Their voices won out. So I think even though on the literal historical sense, the crowds weren't the same, I think as listeners to this gospel, we were invited to say, who put Jesus to death? We all did. We all did.
Of course.
But that's,
It's real hard to accept. It's real hard.
yeah. And that we demanded it, and whether or not God did, it ain't here. You bring that from other parts, but it's not here. It's us. It's us.
Well, we can say that now.
Yes.
But the people at the time then would not, they didn't have a historical perspective
Sure.
to say that.
Sure. And what does he say? Two more things we must recognize, because they're only unique to Luke. One is verse 34. You don't find this anywhere else in the scriptures. Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing." And I think what you just said, Gene, is exactly right. That statement is literally true of them, and I think it is literally true of, this is the way God looks at us in our worst sin as well, and we don't know what we're doing.
Too much of the time.
Yeah. And so that verse, I believe that that's something Jesus says over us for all time. That's not confined to these people. This is a universal statement, I believe, that Luke is inviting us to say. And he says this over you, and he says this over me, and he says this over the people that you love, and he says this over the people that you hate. And it's all.
Grace.
Yes, yes. That's one thing we must recognize. The other is these thieves. What does only show up in Luke's gospel is verse 42 and verse 43. Some of them jeer, I think they jeer and mock, but they're never differentiated. Here they're given two voices. One who says, "Don't you fear, aren't you the Christ? Save us and yourself." The other one says, "Don't you fear God, seeing that you've also been sentenced to die? We're rightly condemned for receiving the appropriate sentence, but this man has done nothing wrong." Which again, we are meant to hold on to that. Pilate says to him, "I see no reason to condemn him." Luke is trying to say, this is an illegal proceeding. This man is truly innocent. And he looks at Jesus. "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus replied, "I assure you today that you will be with me in paradise." This doesn't show up in the other three Gospels. So, amazing quote that gets attributed to St. Augustine. Probably didn't said by St. Augustine. But it's an amazing quote. Do not despair. And this should say one of the thieves. Do not despair, one of the thieves was saved. Do not presume one of the thieves was damned. This is on a banner in a chapel at Northwestern University, which is not a religious institution. And a wonderful movie called Calvary came out several years ago, and it begins with this opening quote, and they attribute it to St. Augustine. Probably not. But I think rooted in Luke's theology, if verse 34 applies to everyone, doesn't it apply to both thieves? And if Jesus is praying that prayer, verse 34, in Luke's gospel, if he's praying it throughout eternity, then we get to ask ourselves, are Jesus' prayers answered or not? And if they are, then we live in a really gracious universe. Yeah, and not one that, the gracious universe we live in isn't one where sin is somehow swept under the rug or made light of or diminished. It's exposed in all of its complexity, in all of its ambivalence, the word I'll use today in my sermon. Ambivalence not meaning indifference, but ambivalence being contradictory emotions, contradictory feelings all at the same time. Evil, sin, whatever we're going to use, sin and evil, in this passage is very complex. Pilate's, who's responsible for Jesus' death? Well, Pilate, he tries to dish it off on Herod. Herod gives it back to Pilate. It's the religious leaders know it's the crowds. Like, there is this ambiguity very intentionally about who's responsible. Yeah, I guess Pilate is literally, we should hold on to that. But it's way more complex than that. And I think what Luke's inviting us to is some way or another, we're all invited to see ourselves as complicit in the death of this innocent man. And his response is, verse 34, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing.
Question.
Yes.
Prior to that, when Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane,
Yes.
he's speaking to God.
Yep.
His Father asking him to take this cup from me. So he knows exactly what's going to happen.
Yeah.
And he's asking, and
Take the cup. Yeah.
God clearly says no.
Yes.
So
Or, yeah, invites him
it's
to.
not, so you were saying how it is all on us, but yet it seems like it was,
Yes, and so what does it mean to say something is the will of God?
yeah.
Very complex, right? When tragedy strikes in our lives, there's a way that you can come to be reconciled to it was the will of God that I think might be helpful, and there's ways that it might be really harmful. So for God the Father there's a cup of suffering in front of Jesus. He knows it. That's why he's here. He's come to Jerusalem to, I think, both expose the evil of the human heart and to forgive it. He's trying to do both. He's drawing the poison out of the wound that is the human heart so that it might be healed.
It's like, let's get this over.
Yeah.
And understand.
And that can be the will of God for Jesus to go through this,
Right.
but it doesn't necessarily mean that God is saying, I want you to suffer too. The will to punish, I like to think, comes from us, not from God. And I think that's important because if we believe that God demands punishment, we will end up reflecting that God, right? We will end up being punishing people as well. We can't help but become the thing that we worship. And so if God is not a punitive God, but one who does recognize the complexity of evil, doesn't overlook it, exposes it so that it might be forgiven, that's the kind of God that I think can help us and help us not be punitive or restorative.
There's this devil's advocate question. I mean, that's a wonderful way of looking at it, but there's a devil's advocate question that even if you attribute human action to all the other instances of God punishing people in the Old Testament, how do you explain casting Adam and Eve out of the garden?
Great question. Or all the other what seems to be punitive. So is that punitive or is that disciplinary? And does the disciplinary meaning like discipline is boundaries placed upon our lives so that we might flourish? That's what discipline I think is at its best, right? It's not merely I'm going to punish you because you did something wrong because I'm mad at you. It's a boundary that is placed upon us so that we might flourish. But there's no doubt that the Bible has.
But it's also irrelevant because the people get the knowledge. I think Mark Twain had a view because first of all, he puts a tree in the garden and says, "Don't touch that." When I tell my children not to touch something, I get extra vigilant.
Sure, because we know what it's going to do.
Their attention. And so, Eve was tempted, patriarchal nature. He was tempted by the serpent. He was justly, according to the traditional view, justly punished too by having to slither from now on.
Sure.
Not walking snake.
Creepy.
But but you know, they didn't fully understand. I mean, it's true to life because they didn't fully understand the implications of what they were doing.
Sure.
It's like
Just like
you know,
34, right? Father,
children,
forgive them,
you know,
they know
say,
not what they're
we
doing.
can just do this. They rationalize. Oh, we'll just do this. I never did that myself. But you know, they rationalize, but then, like things in life, you know, the Hebrews and we have experienced, once they take that step, the consequences are utterly irrevocable and irreversible.
Yep. And that's true to our human experience too. There are words that are said that can't be unspoken, no matter how much we like to.
There are actions
Once you say it, it's out there. And once you do it, it's there.
that you can't be
That's right. It can't be undone.
undone.
So we live our lives east of Eden, right? Which is what Steinbeck wrote the novel. We live our lives east of Eden. And somehow God is committed to us in such a way that we are given what we need to make something good out of the brokenness, even the brokenness of 23. The garden's a complex question, and Jews look at it very differently oftentimes than Christians do. We are given a punitive framework. They often look at the garden as a step towards maturity, which is, you know, if you're going to grow up, your eyes are going to have to get open at some point for good and for bad. There's no, as much as I want to shield my son from the pain of this world, that's actually being a bad parent at some point when we try to shield them from everything.
I mean, but in that case, that would mean, and if you took it from a human evolution perspective, which my anthropological background I drifted into, you know, it's inevitable, but that posits the garden as a good childhood, a stage of life,
That's right.
versus something that they actually could have, could actually retain forever.
Yes, which, if we want to get historically, even scientifically, would have made no sense. Everything in our world is based upon death.
And change.
Right. Everything's
Changes.
based upon change and death and rebirth. It's just, you know, what is the soil in the Garden of Eden except for dead things? That's what soil is. And so this is where our childish understanding of the garden, I think, needs to grow up. Because it doesn't make any sense out of the world as we actually understand it. And so what I love the vision of Jesus entering the world as it actually is, and with all of its complexity and brokenness, and committing to speak a word of forgiveness, even when we insist on crucifixion. That sounds like good news to me. I think we're out of time. We are. But so fun! Yay! I love doing this with you all. Thank you for sharing it with me. Let's pray. And I don't think for Easter, I think we probably won't be here next week for this. We'll have enough going on. Gracious God, we do thank you for the mystery, the miracle, the wonder, the tragedy of the cross. It humbles us. It leaves us with questions. It moves us. And whatever it means, I know it's not an event to be mastered, but it is something upon which we are invited to stand in wonder and awe and to receive somehow those words of forgiveness spoken over each one of us. So as we enter into this holiest of weeks, may our hearts come again and again to the brutality of our world, and we hold on to your word of forgiveness. Amen. Thank you all. I knew we'd have enough to talk about. Didn't have a big PowerPoint. I was like, we'll have enough to talk about. We sure did.
That and Fisher piece.
We're doing
I
there's
share.
an anthropology professor
Right,
wrote a
okay, but
textbook who
it was
just
very